Welcome everyone. Today I want to begin with something that sounds simple, but I want you to really think about it. You were not born believing you weren't enough. You weren't born believing you were unlovable. You weren't born believing everyone would eventually leave you. You weren't born believing your needs were too much. You weren't born believing you had to earn love. And you certainly weren't born believing that another human being choosing or rejecting you determined your value. Somewhere along the way, something happened. Maybe it was something enormous. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe someone abandoned you. Maybe somebody abused you. Maybe love was inconsistent. Maybe affection disappeared whenever you disappointed someone. Maybe you grew up with criticism. Maybe your sibling received the attention you desperately wanted. Maybe your parents loved you deeply, but one of them simply wasn't emotionally available in the way your developing nervous system needed. Or maybe there wasn't one dramatic event at all. Maybe it was thousands of teeny experiences. And this is important because when we hear the word wound, we often immediately go searching for catastrophe. But the developing brain doesn't require a catastrophic event in order to learn. It requires experience, and repeated experiences teach. So something happens. But what happens next is where this becomes fascinating. Because the experience itself isn't necessarily the core wound. The developing brain has to make sense of the experience. It assigns meaning. And sometimes the meaning becomes, it's because of me, Dad left. I wasn't worth staying for. Mom is emotionally unavailable. My needs don't matter. Affection disappears when I make mistakes. I have to be good to be loved. I'm rejected. I'm not enough. And now we've moved from what happened to what happened means about me. That distinction is enormous because eventually that meaning can become a belief. The belief can influence prediction, and prediction can influence attention. Attention influences what becomes significant. Your nervous system responds accordingly. Behavior follows. The consequences of that behavior can reinforce the original belief. And if that loop runs long enough, something you learned can eventually become woven into your sense of identity. You stop saying, I learned to feel inadequate, and begin experiencing, I am inadequate. You stop saying, I learned to fear abandonment, and begin experiencing the world as though everyone leaves me. That's what we're going to unpack here today, the architecture of a core wound. We're going to follow the entire chain: experience, meaning, belief, prediction, attention, nervous system response, behavior, reinforcement, identity. Because once you understand how something was constructed, you can begin asking a radically different question. Not, what's wrong with me, but what did I learn? And eventually, can I learn something different? All right, let's begin. First distinction we need to make is between an event and the meaning learned from that event. Imagine two children experiencing their parents divorcing. Same category of event, but they don't necessarily develop the same psychological meaning. One child may eventually understand, my parents couldn't stay married. Another may internalize, Dad left because I wasn't worth staying for. Another, people you love disappear. And yet another, relationships aren't safe. Another may develop very little enduring negative meaning from the divorce at all. Why? Because human beings don't simply record events like video cameras, we interpret them. Developmental stage matters, temperament matters, previous experiences matter. What happens afterward matters. Whether someone helps the child make sense of what happened matters, and critically, children don't possess the cognitive framework of adults. A 6-year-old cannot necessarily think, my father is struggling with unresolved psychological issues, relationship dissatisfaction, financial stress, and limited emotional capacity. A child is far more likely to ask, what does this mean about me? And that creates an important principle. The wound isn't necessarily only what happened. Sometimes the wound is the conclusion you learned because it happened. That conclusion might be, I'm not enough, I'm unwanted, I'm too much, my needs are dangerous. Love has to be earned. People can't be trusted. If I depend on someone, I'll get hurt. And once that conclusion begins repeating, we move into belief. A belief doesn't have to begin as a sentence consciously spoken inside your head. It can emerge through repeated learning. Imagine a child reaches for comfort when they're distressed. Sometimes comfort arrives, sometimes they're ignored. Sometimes they're criticized. Sometimes their distress makes the caregiver angry. Over time, the child may learn something like, "My needs create problems." Nobody necessarily sat them down and said those words. The nervous system learned through experience. Or imagine another child receives enormous praise when they achieve high grades, athletic success, being helpful, being easy, being impressive. But warmth feels less available when they struggle. What might they learn? My value comes from performance. And now achievement isn't simply something they enjoy. It becomes psychologically loaded because underneath, I want to succeed may eventually live out as I have to succeed in order to be enough. And that's how a belief can begin organizing behavior. And once a belief becomes sufficiently established, the brain doesn't necessarily approach every new situation neutrally. It brings prior learning with it, which brings us back to something we explored throughout the neuroscience of transformation. The brain is predictive. And that's where the architecture gets considerably more powerful. Suppose the learned belief is people leave. Now you enter a relationship. At first, everything is wonderful, but somewhere underneath conscious awareness, previous learning hasn't disappeared. Your brain has a model. Connection eventually becomes loss. So what happens when your partner becomes slightly quieter one evening? Your brain has to interpret incomplete information. Maybe they're tired, maybe work was difficult, maybe they're distracted, maybe absolutely nothing is wrong. But a brain organized around abandonment may give disproportionate weight to another possibility. Something is changing, and prediction changes experience. You may begin scanning. Their text seems shorter. They didn't use the heart emoji. They went to bed without saying goodnight. Their tone sounded different. And suddenly, your nervous system activates. Notice the chain. The current situation did not create the entire response from scratch. Past learning helped interpret the current situation. This doesn't mean every fear is imaginary. Sometimes someone really is withdrawing. Sometimes a relationship really is unsafe. And sometimes your intuition is correctly detecting something. The goal isn't to gaslight yourself. The goal is to recognize that perception always involves interpretation. And our previous learning participates in that interpretation. So now, experience became meaning, meaning became belief, belief became prediction, and prediction begins influencing what receives attention. This is where our previous work on attention and confirmation bias becomes incredibly useful. If your brain expects abandonment, what information becomes especially significant? Distance, silence, changes in tone, delayed messages, reduced affection, ambiguity. Meanwhile, evidence of stability can become psychologically quieter. They've shown up consistently for 6 months. They told you they loved you yesterday. They've repaired conflict repeatedly. They've demonstrated commitment. But one unusual text arrives, and suddenly your entire attentional system lights up. Something is wrong. This is one reason core wounds can become self-reinforcing, because once you have a model of yourself and the world, information consistent with that model may become especially salient or easier to interpret within it. If I believe I'm not enough, rejection becomes extremely meaningful. Someone choosing somebody else becomes extremely meaningful. Criticism becomes extremely meaningful. Failure becomes extremely meaningful. But praise? They're just being nice. Success? I got lucky. Someone loving me? Wait until they really know me. Notice what's happening. Contradictory evidence gets explained away. Confirming evidence gets absorbed. And the wound says, see, I told you. Now the belief feels even more true. But we're still not finished, because prediction and attention don't merely create thoughts. They can contribute to changes in psychology and physiology and physiology changes behavior. Imagine your partner hasn't responded for several hours. The abandonment prediction activates. Your attention narrows. You begin checking your phone. Your heart rate increases. Your stomach tightens. You can't concentrate. You feel an urge to do something. Send another message. Ask whether everything is okay. Check social media. Seek reassurance. Call. Explain. Fix. Restore connection. Now here's where things become extraordinarily important. The behavior isn't random. The behavior makes sense inside the pattern. If your nervous system believes connection is threatened, pursuing connection may feel like survival. Someone watching from the outside might say, "Why don't you just leave them alone?" But internally, your nervous system may be screaming, "Do something before you lose them." And this is why shame is such a poor transformational strategy. Instead of asking, "Why am I so pathetic?" ask, "Why does my nervous system believe this is happening right now?" That doesn't mean every behavior becomes acceptable. Understanding behavior does not remove responsibility for it, but understanding the function of behavior gives us somewhere much more useful to intervene, because now we can see the architecture and then something else can happen. Your behavior changes the environment. You pursue, the other person feels pressured, they withdraw. You experience the withdrawal and your brain says, "See, everyone leaves." The prediction helped generate behavior. The behavior influenced the relationship. The relationship produced evidence, and the evidence reinforced the original wound. That's the loop. Eventually, after enough repetition, something profound can happen. You forget that this was learned. It simply becomes you. I'm anxious. I'm needy. I'm unlovable. I'm the person people leave. I'm bad at relationships. I'm never enough. And identity is powerful because identity doesn't merely describe behavior. It can constrain possibility. If I believe I'm the person nobody chooses, then being chosen may actually feel unfamiliar. If I believe love has to be earned, then someone offering love freely may not produce the intensity I associate with attraction. If I believe I have to prove my worth, then achievement may never create lasting satisfaction, because every achievement simply purchases temporary relief from the wound. This is why core wounds can reach into almost every domain of life: relationships, career, money, sex, achievement, parenting, friendship, body image, perfectionism, people pleasing. The wound doesn't necessarily dictate all of those things, but a sufficiently influential belief can organize enormous amounts of behavior around itself. And that's why the question, "Who am I?" sometimes needs to be followed by, "How much of what I call myself is actually something I learned?" Because there is an enormous difference between "I am not enough" and "somewhere along the way I learned to experience myself as not enough." The first sounds like identity. The second sounds like learning. And learning opens the possibility of new learning. So let's bring the architecture together. Something happened. Your brain had to make sense of it. The experience acquired meaning. Meaning contributed to belief. Belief influenced prediction. Prediction influenced attention. Your nervous system responded. Behavior followed. The consequences of that behavior sometimes reinforced the original belief. And after enough repetition, the pattern began feeling like identity. Experience, meaning, belief, prediction, attention, nervous system response, behavior, reinforcement, identity. And if you're sitting there recognizing yourself somewhere inside that chain, I don't want your conclusion to be, "Jesus Christ, I'm completely fucked." I want it to be, "Oh, this has an architecture," because that changes everything. It means your reactions aren't necessarily random. Your relationship patterns aren't necessarily evidence that you're defective. Your need for reassurance isn't proof that you're weak. Your perfectionism isn't necessarily simply your personality. The fear of abandonment isn't necessarily prophecy. There may be learning underneath it, and if there is learning underneath it, then transformation becomes a different project. We aren't trying to convince a defective human being to become worthy. We're examining the patterns through which a human being learned to question their worth in the first place. That's very different. And this is where repatterning becomes so important to me, because insight lets us see the architecture, but eventually we have to ask, can the pattern itself change? Can the nervous system experience something different? Can old predictions be updated? Can new responses become more available? Can a person who spent decades organizing life around "I'm not enough" eventually stop needing the world to constantly prove otherwise? That's the work. And it's why I use the Spraggan repatterning method as part of the transformational work I do. Not because your past didn't matter. Your past mattered enormously. But because understanding your past shouldn't require you to spend the rest of your life living inside it. So I want to leave you with one question today. Not what's my core wound? Go one step deeper and ask, what happened that taught me to believe this about myself? And then ask the question that opens the door. Is what I learned actually who I am? Your wound may explain the identity you developed. It does not have to become the identity you keep. If you choose healing and you're ready to move beyond simply understanding the story into working with the patterns underneath it, I'd be honored to help guide you through that process. Go check out my link and sign up for the Spraggan repatterning method. Now, until Sunday, understand, repattern, and transform. I'll see you in the next Transformation Masterclass.